talk about the growing concerns about risks involved in using US-based cloud service providers. And he sent PowerPoint. No, but right, and this from a GDPR perspective. I find this quite interesting because we had a long fight with the university about moving to Office 365, which we lost. So all the student data actually is on some cloud service, which is in Ireland, but I think we will hear that this is for sure no problem at all.
Thank you. I see the formatting is a bit different, font size, but we'll manage. Yeah, just as a short introduction, who am I? I have a technical background. I used to work at the Dutch Data Protection Authority. Now I do a lot of data protection impact assessments, as they're called formally. We basically investigate for our customers big cloud services, software packages, to see if they comply with the GDPR and relevant laws, and if there's any risks for the data subjects, so the people using the software and the people whose data is being processed in the software. So the scope, the talk, everything is cloud. Right now, everybody is dependent, and even if it's not cloud, it's mostly US software vendors, at least somewhere in your supply chain, even if you're using European software, European services, it's still Windows, Office. So these international transfers that come along with these international software vendors and service providers, they're everywhere, they're a big problem. So there's lots of areas to think about and be careful about. Just to scope the conversation, this is not what I'm going to talk about, the ICC, basically the reports. I guess everybody read it. The US had sanctions on one of the prosecutors of the International Criminal Court, so he can't use his mailbox anymore, basically. I get this is a really important concern, and it's quite complicated to figure out how this exactly works. Did Microsoft kick him out? Did they ask the ICC to kick him out so they don't have to kick out the entire ICC? I don't know exactly what happened. My formal response to this is not a European institution, so it's out of scope. We do EU data protection stuff, but that's a boring answer. It's still irrelevant, it's a sign for a relevant concern, governments enforcing influence on vendors affecting other organizations. So while this specific example might not be the concern for us, it's still a good example to think about. What do you do when the US starts to influence or continues or changes how they influence, for example, Microsoft or other big software vendors? So what do we do? We have this is an article from the New York Times about Shura, my colleague, who I do most of my work with. And this title is a bit of a caricature of what we do, but I think it gives some nice context. Because formally, what we do is write the DPIA, a big report with investigation, how does the software work, how does the service work, what's being logged. We dive into the technical details, the legal aspects. But those reports by themselves are quite, I think, boring. It's how do you use it to actually change things. And for me personally, and I think for most of our customers too, it's a balance between making sure that the software and the service you depend on has as little risk as possible for data subjects, but also making sure that if stuff does go wrong, there are alternatives. So you need to find that balance. So if the US goes crazy with their measures, with their influence, we have alternatives. So you see, we looked at Google, Microsoft, Zoom, especially like in the COVID period. We checked out different video conferencing solutions because you want to be able to switch. At least our customers want to be able to switch. Another part of this is that at least quite a few of our the biggest customers publish our work to make sure that we have impact. So we don't write a report that ends up like in some drawer somewhere to be ignored by the institution. And because it's published, first of all, everybody can criticize our work if we miss something. That's like nerve-wracking, but that's great to have. But also it increases the impact. If there are findings, everybody will read it, and the vendor has extra pressure to change their product or their service. So in that whole combined approach, not just writing a report, but also the process around it, I think we have some more influence on these big vendors than maybe other organizations have. So I like this public approach, like everything is public, all our findings, at least for these few customers. And it has impact. I know not everybody agrees that we have enough impact. Some people want to move away from Microsoft entirely. But for me, it's important, improve what you can't move away from and look for alternatives. So what I like to do, when I talk to a technical crowd, I like to force you to listen to some legal background and vice versa. I always live in the middle. So what are data transfers exactly? What's in what framework do we live? Under the GDPR, you basically have 4 levels of allowed processing. The most obvious one is processing inside of the European Economic Area. That's fine. There's no special rules for that. GDPR applies, period. Then there's countries where the European Commission has said, okay, the laws in that country are similar enough, basically the similar protection level. So we put a stamp on the entire country. You can treat them kind of as they're inside of the EU. So that's fine. That's kind of almost where the US lives at the moment. And then there's 2 levels with appropriate safeguards and derogations for specific situations, what I'm not going to talk about, where you can have big piles of contracts and technical measures to kind of make do in with processing in a country where it's not good enough by itself. That's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about how the US fits in that second category, and especially for you also, what technical measures are relevant to maybe work around some of the legal inadequacies that might be there, legal risks. So the US has kind of a weird construct where they're kind of not exactly adequate. What does it mean? Well, they have had a series of special programs. It's kind of an opt-in program for organizations, so they can say, yeah, we are part of well, first Safe Harbor, then Privacy Shield, and then Data Privacy Framework. And organizations that opt in are considered like good enough, and they are bound by special oversight and special protection rules. But the situation is kind of unstable. So pre-GDPR, we had Privacy Shield. On the timeline, like pre-GDPR is to the left of the screen. And then, let's start with Safe Harbor. Safe Harbor was a program from 2000 to 2015. And Max Schrems, like a privacy lawyer, brought a court case forcing the EU to basically take down the approval of the Safe Harbor framework. They fixed that with Privacy Shield a short while after 2015, and Privacy Shield carried over into the introduction of the GDPR. And then there was a big case called Schrems 2. That's the same Max Schrems, who said, yeah, there might be some improvements, but the problem is more structural. You can't fix it with you can't basically opt into more protection to protect you against intelligence services in the US. That's not how that works. So Schrems won again. So in 2020, Privacy Shield failed. And from that day, there was no adequacy-like mechanism in the US. And that was actually enforced. So Uber got a fine of 290 million euros for the period of somewhere in 2021 to 2023 for no adequate measures for data transfers. Like for me personally, Uber did way more than basically any other organization in a similar situation. But Uber got a fine. I expect them to fight this, but so in the end, the fine might disappear or be way less in practice, but this was the base fine. And the infraction ended when the data privacy framework started. So that's where we are now. There are some people who believe that the reason why basically Safe Harbor and Privacy Shield failed is still not resolved. You still have intelligence services that you really can't protect against with an opt-in framework like this. So looking at the history, I might, I can imagine why people say, yeah, you might not be able to trust data privacy framework for much longer. But right now, we live in a situation where the DPF is valid. So we must acknowledge data transfers to the US under the DPF is legally good. We can't say you're not allowed to do that because we think DPF will be invalidated. You might disagree with the actual risk in practice, but legally it's still valid. And it's unknown if or when DPF will be invalidated. You can try to put bets on it, but it's really hard to predict. I think the important question is, do you have enough time to take new measures when DPF is invalidated? So for example, in 6 months, some court says, yeah, DPF is not valid anymore, and the European Commission pulls the plug. Can you maybe switch vendors the next day? Or do you need to prepare right now for that when it happens in maybe 6 months, maybe a year, maybe never? So I would say prepare for the possibility, at least have backup options. But maybe important, if we say right now it's good enough, that's because we have to accept this. I can't predict the future. So what do we see in practice? Because like the legal status of DPF was one thing, but we also see people from organizations. I think that this is the remark I hear the most. Luckily not from our customers, but from people elsewhere. Like, yeah, I use AWS, but I just select the EU data center, so there's no transfer of personal data. That's way too easy. And often it's just not true. But if you believe this, from the outside, it's really hard to check. I can maybe see AWS is used in the infrastructure, but I can't really see how it's configured behind the screen. So yeah, we set a checkbox in the admin interface, so everything is fine. It's a really easy thing to say to the outside. Please don't check any further. I don't trust this. So what do we see in practice? When doing our work, we have kind of like a mental model of how we look at these services that mostly fits the stuff we look at. We have some like office environment, the laser pointer doesn't work, like your desk with emails, photos, whatever, documents, like the work you actually do. And it's mostly the content. Almost everybody looks at the content because that's the bulk of the data. What we see is also there's functional data. For example, when I make a video call, it's just like the network traffic going back and forth over the internet. That's not really like, it's not only the content that's in the traffic, but it's also traffic metadata. When am I calling? Who am I calling? That's like functional traffic that just happens to be there because you use the service. And there's also diagnostic data. So all kinds of logging, whether it's like security logging or maybe developers putting like debug statements in the code to collect like, do people click this button? What's the response time when this feature is activated? Stuff like that. That can also contain personal data. So that server location button, choices like that, often focus on content. And people mostly don't discuss functional and diagnostic data. So that's where we see a lot of risks. And often in the documentation, in small print, it just says, yeah, that button guarantees, for example, that your VM is actually located in that data center. But it mostly doesn't explicitly say, but it doesn't protect network traffic, logging, stuff like that. You have to dig deep in fine print, and it's often not explicitly documented. So transfers can be hidden. I have a few quotes. I don't expect you to read them all. Basically, the cooperation of data protection authorities, the EDPB, the European Data Protection Board, has written all kinds of documents also about transfers, where they explain these kinds of issues for everybody to at least have some common feeling of what do we need to deal with. So they give a really useful example, like keep in mind that remote access from a third country, for example, in support situations, that might also be transfer. So you say, I put my server in an EU data center, but there's still US tech support employees, or maybe from another country. If there's an issue, they can log in, check stuff out, hopefully fix it. That can still be a transfer if the tech support processes the personal data in your servers. Also important, often you have an entire, like basically a tree of sub-processors. So you have the big cloud vendor who has some companies who they, for example, for support, they hire in different countries, different organizations, and they hire subcontractors. So you have a huge like tree structure of sub-processors, sub-sub-processors, so that can get out of hand really quickly. These are two things that are really hard to deal with and even like map out what's possible. We have sometimes like technical solutions for the first. You can build in guarantees like only have support staff from the EU respond to my tickets, but then you don't get like the follow the sun support. So these can get uncomfortable. Yeah, if there's an emergency, please wait until like 9 o'clock on a weekday. And if it's the evening or the weekend, yeah, tough luck, you wanted EU only support. So that's uncomfortable. But it can be dealt with if you're in a, like, if you don't have a fully EU-based organization, you can manage this. Then for me, this is the fun stuff, encryption. So the EDPB gave up like mostly like two clean, easy example, like you have external backups, where they say, yeah, if you just encrypt the backups locally, and you retain full control of the keys, and the encryption is proper, you can just encrypt everything, send the backups offsite, and then when you need them, get the backups back. Hopefully you have your keys, still have your keys and decrypt. So in that case, encryption is a really good measure to basically prevent access from outside of the EU. That's fine. That's a kind of like too simple example, because yeah, backups are important, but they're like a tiny piece of the puzzle. Pseudonymization is an example. I want to name this, but in practice, I don't think I ever encountered this in the international transfer setting. But you can think of like if we send research data, like medical data, for example, to outside countries outside of the EU. You might say we pseudonymize, we might change the name of all the patients in the test data, so we can collaborate on the data without them being able to know who the data subjects are. To me, it's a quite complicated measure, not that effective, but I want to mention it. This stuff gets into the real world scenarios. Like I want to use a cloud service. I don't want to store data, but I want to have stuff outsourced to some cloud service and actually have the cloud service do useful stuff for me. Like I want to search inside the documents. I want to, I don't know, do word processing or have Excel sheets or databases or whatever. Or maybe even virtual machines. So given the context of the backups, what the EDPB said, you have to retain full control of your keys. They said, yeah, considering the current state of the art, and that's 2021, so that's like a while back, not that far. They say, yeah, but we don't see any solutions of like retaining your own keys while also outsourcing the entire processing. You kind of have to give them the keys if they want to do useful stuff with the data. This is where stuff gets interesting, because the state of the art is changing, but it's less clear, it's less obvious that that's comparable to the backup scenario. One thing I see that I'm kind of critical about is customer managed keys. That's basically you outsource everything, but you have a key server as a customer that a cloud server can talk to. So they maybe like each 5 minutes they ask like, can we have the encryption key so we can work on the data? And we promise not to store the encryption key. We just keep asking the encryption key and forgetting it and asking it again. So what does it look like? I think you have some compute server and some storage and like a safe, some kind of key server, all inside of the cloud environment. And then you have a customer talking to the entire servers. They don't see anything weird, like different from a normal scenario. But the cloud provider says, yeah, but it's a hardware security module. We can't touch the key. We just have hardware that can ask for the key, but we can't get inside of the hardware security module. Yeah, I think if you have access to that machine that can request the key, then you have access to the keys. It's a bit more nuanced in practice, but I don't think this is comparable to fully controlling the keys as a customer. So the key is in the safe. So instead of customer managed keys, you also have the entirely different scenario of customer controlled keys. So you just don't just manage the keys, you put the key server outside. You can host your own key server. If you lose the key server, you lose all your data. That's on you now. But that HSM, the hardware security module that we couldn't get into, we also can't get physical access now, says the cloud provider. For me, the issue was never physical access, but just that they can request the key from it. So the location really doesn't matter that much. But this is also a solution I see a lot. There's one advantage is that you can log access to the key maybe a little bit better and monitor how it's used. But I'm not sure how much that will accomplish. Then it gets more complicated. And this is the area where I'm starting to think, yeah, maybe that can be good enough. You have confidential compute services now. They're getting quite common in the big cloud vendors. So yeah, it's called confidential compute. Name changes slightly between vendors. It's based on like AMD secure encrypted virtualization, Intel trust domain extensions. Different platforms have different names. The concept is more or less the same. You have that HSM, but that HSM now covers both the key and the server, kind of. So it's an extension to CPUs where they say, yeah, the key is managed inside an HSM, inside the CPU, and we encrypt all the RAM. So even if you like take out the RAM and try to read it, or even if you control like the underlying operating system that handles all the virtualization, even then you shouldn't be able to access the keys. You shouldn't be able to access the encrypted virtual machine inside. To me, it's getting way less obvious that a cloud vendor can either like access or be forced to access these keys. Or the data inside. Like as long as the service that's in the encrypted, like in the confidential compute module, encrypts the data before it's stored, it kind of looks secure. But the challenge is, how do I assess this? Like I'm sure you're all familiar like with how do you prove the security of your like cryptography. That's a difficult enough conversation. But how do I prove that I am actually running on the hardware that I think I'm running on when it's in the cloud and I can't touch it? And there's all kinds of solutions for that. But how do I test that it's actually secure? I don't have the expertise of the NSA, for example, to maybe find backdoors in those CPUs or maybe not, or vulnerabilities in these mechanisms. So how do I assess this? For me, this is like a really big challenge that if I have proper guarantees or enough trust in this, I can say, well, if you just use these technologies to encrypt your VMs, suddenly you can do a lot of in the cloud that you might otherwise not trust in a cloud scenario. So if you're working on stuff like this, please let me know. For me personally, I think if this stuff works as designed, it's really hard to say why it's not good enough. And we actually encounter this like in the wild. For example, we did an assessment of AWS, and I think it's called Nitro in AWS. And they have quite comprehensive like audit reports and external parties looking at this stuff that can do the security assessment better than me, but I have to trust those assessments. But you can read our assessment of it. It's published by the national government. And we do that in the form of a DPIA, so that's a big report describing how the services work, what the legal context is, trying to assess like the risks for data subjects, and also a data transfer impact assessment. That's another tool. That's a giant spreadsheet with like different like analysis of the different processes happening inside of the service, and analysis of the different national laws, and kind of an attempt to model like what's the chance that maybe the NSA can access content data. So both these DTIAs and the DPIAs are published. Surf is also like one of those customers that publishes our work. We're really happy about it. So we did a DTIA and a DPIA on Google Meet for Workspace, for video conferencing, different contexts. There you can do more in encryption on the end user device, so you don't have to store much data in the cloud. That's easier. And there's a huge pile of Google and Microsoft work and assessments from us that's published by the national government. Thanks. So this was my last slide, but if you want more details, feel free to read this, ask questions right now, or if you don't want to ask questions right now, tackle me during the day. I'm happy to talk about this more. But I have time for questions now.
Thanks a lot for the talk. Do we have questions?
No questions?
This is the microphone. You just talk into the thank you for this. Was really interesting. I have a practical question. I work now in a big company on international data transfers, and we have assessed the possibility of using a trusted third party to hold our encryption keys to prevent the issues that you have outlined, but we have found that with many of the technical infrastructure that is commonly used in companies, the encryption keys are usually first created, for example, in Salesforce, and then they would be transferred to us. So we have found that we couldn't really solve the issue that the encryption key is still at, for example, Salesforce. Do you have experience with that, and do you know how to solve this?
Yes. Trying to say, I'm not sure what's public about, so I'll talk to me afterwards, but for everyone else, like the superficial answer is, it maybe doesn't really matter, like if you outsource the key server. I just purposely, like, this can also be a trusted third party. What matters is that to use the service, for example, like Salesforce, they have basically like big Excel sheets of of data from your customers or whatever. They need to retrieve the key to decrypt the data, work on it, and then give you the results back in the web page. So it's still Salesforce accessing the keys, accessing the encrypted data, and accessing the decrypted data. So for me, it's really hard to see like how it's mostly it limits the scope of access they have, and that's really hard to assess in a way that you say, yeah, that's. But if they can only access it like for 5 minutes and then they have to renew the key, like, does it help? I'm not sure. But there's lots of details to look into. But I from your question, I think you're looking at the right type of risks.
Have any further questions? I have a brief one. Where's the difference in complexity of checking, for example, that encryption is doing what it's supposed to do compared to these secure enclaves, essentially?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm not sure I have a really strong answer, but the answer I have is, like with encryption, I know like there's like a strong like academic like process of also like trying to find flaws in each other's crypto. So when there's kind of like accepted crypto standards and it's used in the way it's intended, so you keep the keys, have the right algorithms, the right key length, stuff like that, I trust that that's good enough. That if you just have access to the encrypted data, you can't do anything with it, except maybe you destroy it. So you need to have backups, but you can't modify it, you can't read it, you can't influence like bits in it or something in a useful way. So that's something I trust because of that. Like, it's fully open. I know the algorithm. The algorithm has to run locally because I have to encrypt it, so I can be either audit or implement the software myself. Don't implement your own crypto algorithms, but that's kind of a manageable scenario, I think. When it's hardware, I'm not sure if there's many academic groups who dive deep into AMD hardware virtualization implementations. I'm sure there are a few, but it's way less accessible because you need both crypto and hardware expertise, and you need maybe access to like, how do you debug CPUs? How do you check if it's actually, it's not physically in your control, it's in a data center. So how you check if it's the same hardware that you checked running in a data center? That's an incredibly difficult problem. So it might be solvable in the same way, but I'm not quite sure how. It's much more complicated, I think. No online questions? Oh.
for the presentation. That was really fun to listen to and interesting. I have a question actually about physical control. EU has been quite persistently pushing for a backend, a backend for end-to-end encryption, currently for services, applications, and databases. So, how even effective is the physical control in this scenario where the information can be accessed to a backend?
I think the honest answer is I really don't know. My frustration with the encryption backdoor debate is there's quite a few people calling for, yeah, but we still kind of need access to that encrypted stuff. And then you nerds figure it out how we can get it securely. You keep saying you can't give secure access, but you'll figure it out, you're smart. Like, I don't know how to deal with that unless there's an actual concrete proposal how to implement it. I can assess it. I don't have much trust that there's a secure way to do it, depending on your definition of what's secure, maybe. But I really don't know what kind of solution, backdoor type solution, would be proposed here. The entire purpose of this is to prevent access from that country, even if it's the scenario is basically this cloud stuff is in a country where they say we need lawful access to that data. And this part is in a country where they say, yeah, but your lawful access is unlawful here. That's what we need a solution for. So building a backdoor into this system to make this access possible here kind of defeats the purpose. But it depends. Yeah, I don't know what will be the outcome of this backdoor debate.
Thanks for the talk. So I wanted to say that when some of these, let's call them anonymous web services company, AWS, an acronym, if they happen to have a hardware security module, the scam that they pull is that they give the hardware security module, for example, to the police, and the police take it to the company that makes it, and the company that makes it has a backdoor and gives out the keys. So the original company doesn't know about the mechanics of the backdoor, so probably, but the mechanics of the seizure have leaked until now. So my question is, how can you deal with any of the services where, for example, there's a VM that's hosted that uses this? Like, on what basis is any of that trustworthy? For example, most VMs allow for being migrated between hosts, which means that the CPU registers, all RAM, everything is usually transferred, and then they can see it. And then it relies on this hardware where it's basically the equivalent of Trust Me Bro, but with a PCI device. And are any of them audited in a way where you get to see the source code or hardware so that the EU actually has a basis for trusting it, other than some companies said it's secure?
I fully appreciate your question, but I think I'm going to be a bit pedantic. I don't think access to source code is good enough, because I don't know that's the source code that's running on that specific device. So it's kind of the Trust Me Bro model, I think. That's what makes it so difficult to assess. So you either you have a choice. Do you trust the audits that they have done, and do you kind of trust the cloud vendor? That's maybe up to you. I think in most cases, working with these cloud vendors, and I'm not saying this is a thorough assessment, but I think generally these cloud vendors don't want to provide access to governments generally. So my mental model is mostly the cloud vendor wants to do the right thing, but they might be forced to cooperate. So that's maybe a slightly different, a slightly easier like mental like threat model. But I have no guarantees that that's the correct model. So yeah, great question.
Thanks a lot again for the answers. We have to move to the next talk. Let's thank Floor again. Okay, another go. So next we have Savio from the security group here in Eindhoven, and he will talk about identifying radio frequency devices via wireless signals. So, and I think he will talk a bit about the dark side of a general useful technology that allows also to spy on you.
Thank you. So I hope you can hear me out online. So thank you for the presentation. So today I will talk about one of the research areas active here at TU Eindhoven in the area of wireless security. So quite of a switch from the cloud perspective we discussed so far. We go more to the physical world around us. In particular, I will discuss about another form of usage of a technology that is more famous with the name of radio frequency fingerprinting, something that is a lot used as an additional security layer, basically for wireless devices, but it can also be used, looking at another perspective, as a way to threat the privacy of users by tracking basically the wireless devices in possession of the user. That's a brief agenda of what I will discuss about. And in particular, I start from the very basics, the radio frequency fingerprinting. That's a research domain that was born around the 90s, 95 of the previous century, but at the boom starting from approximately 2010, when it was clear that it could be possible to use it, especially with respect to constrained devices. And then finally, 2015, with the introduction, basically more in the general public, of deep learning solutions that make it possible to identify basically devices based on their features, but in a range of different scenarios. Where does it come from? Basically, the idea is that normally in your wireless devices, in your commercial off-the-shelf devices, you have these chips that you see here in the slides. And this is what you see of your wireless chip, nothing else. But there is a lot happening inside of the chip after you give basically through your host the bits to this radio chip for being transmitted. This is what you have basically inside your chip. These circuits that you see here that are basically hardware circuits, you can implement it in principle both in software or in hardware. However, doing that in software is a lot expensive because you need devices that are able to process signals at very high frequency. So the usual choice that all the manufacturers make basically for cost considerations is to have all these circuits implemented in hardware. Basically, you see mixers, you see oscillators, phase shifters, a lot of different hardware components. All these hardware components that are done in hardware, they have their own inaccuracies. They are physically done to do a job good enough, and even when they are printed on the circuit, they have some small tolerances in the order, for example, of micrometers. Of course, these tolerances do not affect the capability of the device to operate as it should. They transmit bit, and they have approximately the same performance. But if you look at the signals that are transmitted over the wireless channel, there are very small differences, subtle differences that, although not impacting on the quality of the communication link, affect basically the specific way they are received at the receiver. Let's take an example. For example, a generic quadrature phase shift keying modulation, where you have 2 bits per symbol, 00, 01, 10, and 11, and then base for symbol. What you would expect, what you do software level, is to basically encode these, the 4 bits, to one of these four values. And you would expect to receive them at the receiver exactly the same. Surprise, surprise, that's not the case. Already, if you would have the possibility to see these at the transmitter, you will notice that you will have these clouds here, because the transmitter tries to transmit them with a given precision. But there is always an inaccuracy in the specific value that it actually transmits. It's not a 1, but it's a 1.0001. It's an imprecision that the particular wireless device cannot control because it's inherent in the inaccuracy, basically, of the hardware components of the device. At the receiver, on top of these inaccuracies originating from the transmitter, there is the channel. If you are lucky, you get the situation at the top right, where you have those clouds originally originated by the transmitter, plus some more noise, meaning that the channel is not that noisy. But if you are unlucky, for example, you take this situation that is the signal you receive, for example, from a satellite, you get very noisy signals. So your clouds that were originated by the transmitter now are completely, basically hidden in the noise. So at the receiver, in this case, of course, in the case here, right back, you have a problem also with the signal-to-noise ratio, with the bit error rate. But in general, if you look at above, then that configuration does not really cause problems in terms of quality of the communication. But at the same time, could allow you to identify who is the transmitter in a set of different transmitters. If you look at the situation that you have, for example, in a cable link, that's where what we call features of the transmitting device emerge very well. This is, of course, an ideal situation. It's just an example, because it's not only these features that that characterize the specific transmitters, but if you look at it in a diagram like this, you don't need any AI. With your naked eye here, you could tell among these 12 devices who is the one transmitting. So in a cable link, or when you are connected via cable, the task of identifying a specific device is very easy. The problem is when you go over the wireless channel, because the channel actually hits the specific features that you want to use to recognize the device. The security assumptions that normally are associated with the radio frequency fingerprinting are mainly two. The first one is that the profile of the IQ samples, the actual raw signal at the receiver, depends on the hardware of the transmitting device and the properties of the channel between the transmitter and the receiver. That's exactly what we discussed in the previous slide. The second assumption is that the transmitter has very limited control over the specific value of these IQ samples that are transmitted over the wireless channel. You can say to the device, you can tell to the device to transmit a 1, the device will transmit a 1 with a very small inaccuracy to the 6th or the 7 decimal digits that the device cannot control, but that can be used at the same time to identify the device. If these two main assumptions hold, then the radio frequency fingerprinting is possible, and the regular, normal way this is used, typically also a lot in the scientific literature, is as an additional security layer to the existing devices. Because basically you can identify who is transmitting without even modifying anything on the transmitter. You don't need any cryptography solution. You don't need any software specific on the device. You can do that completely passively by just analyzing the raw wireless signal that is transmitted by these devices. This is also very useful, for example, if your keys get leaked. Typically, you use cryptographic keys, for example, to do authentication. If your keys get leaked and another device transmits exactly the same signal, then looking at these hardware characteristics, you can recognize that it's not the device for which the key was originally assigned to transmit that message, but it's another device. And so you can do a form of basically physical layer authentication of the devices. That's normally how radio frequency fingerprinting is used. Of course, you need specific hardware available at the receiver side. You need an hardware that is able to go down at the physical layer to analyze the raw wireless signal transmitted by the device. And this is not something that you usually have in commercial off-the-shelf devices. There are some of them that may allow for you to do that. There are some Texas Instruments chips now that allow you to see the raw IQ samples. But normally what you will need is a software-defined radio. So it's a radio that is able, basically like a spectrum analyzer, to see the raw wireless signal and process the raw wireless signal. On top of that, due to the availability of basically to the presence of the wireless channel that could complicate the detection of this feature, what you need is also some powerful hardware that can run some deep learning algorithm, and so it can tell apart basically the features of one transmitter with respect to the other. They are a bit what we call the requirements, or if you want to call them the constraints, of using this as an additional security layer. There are a lot of software-defined radios available. There are even some small dongles that were used originally for receiving TV signals that were hacked and can work as a software-defined radios. And they are available on the market on Amazon, for example, for as low as 20 euros. So not necessarily you need an hardware like the ones that you see here that is significantly expensive. You can do that also with hardware that is not that powerful. There is a lot of research on radio frequency fingerprinting from a lot of research groups all around the world. And this is mostly about using this as an additional security layer. You can see just from these titles that this has been applied to satellites, to IoT devices, to drones, even to aircrafts to recognize which one is that. So different technologies, different communication paradigms. Today, this is really used. We are also, as a research group in this area, we applied this, for example, for the satellites. And we have also some ongoing research at UE on this area, using RFF as a security feature. For example, we investigate real-world factors that impact your accuracy to do radio frequency fingerprinting. We discovered, for example, that simply power cycling the devices changed the fingerprint of one device. And in some devices, even reloading the firmware changes that fingerprint a bit. Based on that, we were able to discover basically, or to come up with models that are very robust to small variations basically triggered by these embedded systems. This is the angle of the problem, more of using radio frequency fingerprinting as a security feature. However, if you are a little bit, let's say, familiar with the security and privacy aspects, you may also have noticed that this can also be used on the other way. If you have a now unauthorized receiver, an eavesdropper can collect the wireless emissions of the devices in the wild, then train a model based on you and be able to recognize your device when it's present in the given reception area of the device. So this motivated some of our efforts to go into the other direction, basically flipping the problem and say, can radio frequency fingerprinting be used as an attack vector to track the devices in the wild? We have some preliminary research more on the attack side. I will not show that in the slides. That basically shows you that if you are able to collect the profile the raw wireless signals of the device at different locations in a given area, then by training on all these samples on different locations, your capability to track the devices, even in different locations in the same area of that particular device, is possible. Of course, that requires some more computational capabilities, but in general, the threat is possible. And the specific threat can be configured in two different ways. The most powerful adversary model that you can think about is an adversary that knows the RF profile of all the transmitters in a given area and can then track each of them by telling this device apart from all the others that he knows. This is the most powerful adversary model you can think about. What in the rest of this talk basically will be called as A1. Another possibility is that the adversary only knows one profile of one device and tries to follow this device in a range of, in an area where there are different devices that it doesn't know. You need different techniques, different attack vectors to do that. You need, in the first case, a multi-class, basically, classifier, while in the other case, you need a one-class classifier because you need to know only one device. But the two attacks, technically speaking, they are possible. So this is the main threat that we considered. The problem is that if you want to mitigate basically this tracking, you have to take into account what each wireless device or normal wireless device can do. You cannot really tell to this device to change the fingerprint, or you cannot install software on a mobile, for example, to change the profile of the emitted device, because that will simply not happen. The software of the device does not control or minimally control, as we have seen, the hardware of the device. So you cannot basically modify or impose physical layer modifications to the transmitter in the general case. At the same time, you also would like to keep the communication performances of the devices the same. So you don't want to degrade the signal-to-noise ratio that you experience at a given receiver, and more importantly, the bit error rate. You want to continue transmitting with the same performances. You also have to consider that whatever you do, the adversary could be able to adapt. So when you do some modifications, the adversary could be able to retrain the model, and then based on this new model, let's say, model of your emissions that you have created, keep tracking the devices. That's something that can be done in both the adversary models. In particular, we defined two concepts basically to work with that. One is the traditional K anonymity. So you want to identify one in a set of K, and T anonymity when you want to be anonymous independently of the set of transmitters that are in a given area. Taking into account all these constraints that the problem have, we basically investigated with a first solution to this problem that we called finger jam, that is basically about deploying a low-power jammer, so an external device, basically, close to the device that you want to protect. This jammer is basically what is more famous, let's say, as a friendly jammer. So is a jammer that injects just a low power to thwart the radio frequency fingerprinting, but not to affect the quality of the communication link. It's just a low power noise, basically, that is not affecting the quality of the communication, but affecting the shape of the signal that you receive at the receiver. You have to deploy this jammer close to the transmitter, of course, because you don't know where the receiver is. And the challenge is to basically understand if this works, if you can really thwart the radio frequency fingerprinting without affecting the quality of the communication link. That's the main idea we experimented with. And To the same, we have a lot of results based on a real deployment campaign that we did. In particular, the results that I will show you now are based on 5 different transmitters that we deployed in an office environment. So in a normal environment with interferences already occurring because there are many devices already there communicating, we used one receiver. The radios that you see here in these slides are radios that are particularly powerful. They are the USRP X3010. And we used 2 main communication links. One is a cable link, just to understand the impact of our phenomenon, the impact of how the jammer affects basically the radio fingerprints. And then for the other experiments, we use the wireless channel. Most of the results you will see are based on the wired channel, the cable link, because we wanted to understand really what are the boundaries between fingerprinting and not fingerprinting the device. And then the other, let's say, results more in the wild with the wireless channel. To control better the deployment, to fine-tune the intensity of the jamming we were basically injected into the wireless channel, we used also attenuators. Attenuators that are on the jammer, 20 dB and 40 dB, so a small attenuation and a more significant attenuation. And we changed also the power of the signal injected by the jammer. You see here that there are different relative transmission power that you can use on the jammer. So 0.01%, that 0.01 means 1% of the overall power available on the jammer, up to 100% of the power available. So we experimented with different, basically, power levels. First, we did an analysis of the, let's say, impact of the jammer on the quality of the communication link, in particular by looking at the SNR. You see on the figure on the left that in general, as you would expect, by increasing the power of the jammer, the quality of the communication link between the transmitter and the receiver basically decreases. That means that the signal-to-noise ratio is decreasing. The challenge here is not to decrease the signal-to-noise ratio up to the point that it decreases the quality of the communication link. So the lines that you see on the right part of the figure, the violet one, the cyan one, the blue, they are affecting the quality of the communication, something that you don't want. Instead, the green and the black ones especially, they are minimally affecting the quality of the communication. They cause small variations with respect to not having any jamming. So they are the ones basically where we focused more because they don't cause any drop in the quality of the communication. You also see in the slides on the right that in general also the attenuators can further attenuate the intensity of the jammer and keep the signal-to-noise ratio more close to the one that you experience without any jammer. So we focused more in that region because that region didn't cause any drop in the quality of the communication. We started with a benchmark, so the traditional radio frequency fingerprinting, but without jamming. For example, in the scenario of k-anonymity. So here there are a lot of techniques that you can use to do radio frequency fingerprinting. The ones that we used for this particular work, they were the ones that we refined through analysis of different, let's say, phenomenon that can happen in the real world. For example, the reload of the radios or the changes of the channel. So techniques that are already known to be particularly robust to changes to the channel. They're also techniques that are likely to be able to be basically used by the adversary to do actually the tracking. Based on those, basically, we transformed the problem into a classification problem where you classify images based on a set of signals that you receive, and then the problem becomes basically an image classification problem that can be done, again, multi-class or one class based on the training set that you have. You see here, especially in the figure on the upper part, that independently from the specific network, multi-class network that you use, the task is always feasible for the adversary without jamming. You always have classification accuracy that are basically very, very close to 1. They are 0.99. So this confirms in general that these techniques, these classifiers, are able to identify the wireless devices without any noise added to the transmissions. Starting from this point, basically we added through the jammer, through the actual experiments on the wireless cable, we added noise, and so to how much extent basically the classifier is still able to identify the transmitters. You see in this figure the results on the cable, basically, where we increased the relative jamming power of the jammer, and you see that, as you would expect, by increasing this jamming power, the signals that are received by the receiver are different. So the performance of these models start to decrease. The interesting result is that you need a relative jamming power of 0.3, as you see in this slide, to completely transform the output of your classifiers basically in a random guess. 0.2 here because we have 5 transmitters. So over 5 transmitters, the random guess is 20%. So only a relative jamming power of 0.3 is it's enough to have random guess. That relative jamming power of 0.3 at the same time affects the signal-to-noise ratio and the bit error rate. So the actual challenge is to have these two parameters, to basically trade off between these two parameters. You have that trade-off approximately at 0.1 jamming power, as we have seen in the previous slide, and there the classification accuracy, depending on the classifier that the adversary is using, is ranging between 0.6 and 0.4. That starting from 1 could be, from some scenarios, something already acceptable for some scenarios. It depends a little bit on what your target is in terms of protection against the devices. We also experimented with the other attack scenario, the one weaker, let's say, that is the case where the adversary only knows one specific device and tries to identify that device in a range of wireless devices. Basically, what we investigated here, we used an autoencoder as a one-class classifier. So the task is classifying images coming from the same transmitter. What you see here is that, first, the random guess line. The random guess line, it's basically the diagonal of this graph, the main diagonal. And it means that any point basically lying on this is indistinguishable from the model on which we trained. So the two models are the same. The more the curves or the samples go toward the upper part of the graph, basically the more the two profiles are distinguishable. And so the adversary can tell apart that particular transmitter from another one, or that can identify basically the two devices. You see that with 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, we get a bit away from the diagonal, but it's with the other ones that you make the two devices completely different one from the other. So by adding noise, basically the, let's call new signal, the testing signals, becomes increasingly different from the one that you have during the training. We also experimented with different attenuators, so 0 dB, 20 dB, 40 dB, with the requirement that all the signals we are further processing have the same bit error rate of the ones we experience without jamming. So all the signals that we have are characterized by that condition, no bit error rate. As expected, the less the jammer attenuation, so the higher the jamming power, the more different the radio fingerprints are. And so the accuracy of the radio frequency fingerprinting is basically reduced. That is what we want. We want to transform this problem for the adversary in a random guess. We also went to the radio link. So we did the same experiments, but on the radio. We collected first the signals from the devices, and then we tested it on signals that are basically affected by the noise inserted by the low-power jammer. Again, the same considerations that we had before. The low bars are the ones basically with the jamming power 0, while the higher one are with the jamming power 1. The two different profiles are completely different, although being characterized by the same bit error rate that you experience without jamming. Of course, to do that, you also need an attenuator, because otherwise the power is too much and degrades the quality of the communication link. This is, let's say, the easiest scenario, the scenario where the adversary cannot retrain his models. But the adversary can also be basically adaptive. So when it starts to understand that his performances are decreasing, it could dynamically retrain the models and try to update his models to follow this new profile of the emissions of the devices. And that comes the challenge. In the most powerful scenario, the scenario where the adversary knows all the devices, you see on the left that when the adversary trains on all the different power levels, then his performances remain very high, even if you increase the relative jamming power. So basically, considering the most powerful adversary model, the adversary wins, is able to continue track the devices. When the adversary instead, and I focus on the figure on the right, only knows one particular device and tries to update the model, then his task becomes a little bit more difficult. There are some devices, for example, you see the device number 4, that are completely distinguished from the other devices. So in that case, for the device number 4 in these tests, the adversary can be still successful because it has basically a classification capability very close or in sometimes even higher than the 90%. There are other devices instead that become more similar to others, and so they are less distinguishable with themselves. You see, for example, device number 2 or device number 3 that are characterized by lower accuracy. So those are less distinguishable even after adding noise from other devices. So the solution, to a limited extent, could work in that scenarios. But that, of course, depends on the specific transmitter. So you have no guarantees that a solution like this would work. And this is exactly basically the starting point of the final considerations after all this discussion. So radio frequency fingerprinting in general, it's something that it's possible to be used on the other way, in a powerful way, independently basically from our solution, but it's possible to use it to track in the wild wireless devices. Protecting against such a threat is not really straightforward because you have the constraints of commercial devices. You don't want to touch as much as possible these devices. The solution we experimented with in these results that I showed you is a solution where you use a low power jammer to externally, without modifying the device, try to protect its privacy. It works to a limited extent. It can work based on the device if the adversary only knows one and tries to follow you with that one. But if the adversary knows everything, as we saw in the previous results, basically it doesn't work. If it knows everything and is able to retrain its models. This is also basically an acknowledgement to the power basically of these AI algorithms that are able still to recognize the device, although their emissions basically are hidden in significant amount of noise. What's next? Basically, the road ahead that we are still investigating, we started to do that, is to see if by having the possibility to inject noise on the transmitter side, we could be more lucky. So what if we have a transmitter that is able to corrupt intentionally a little bit its signal? Does this improve the situation compared to having an external jammer that can do that? Of course, that would require a complete change of the hardware of the transmitter. That's something that, of course, should be taken into account. But maybe we are more lucky on this side. And the partial results that we have from another work that is not the previous one that I discussed is that it seems that when the transmitter intentionally corrupts the signal, then it's really more successful to thwart the adaptive adversary, even if he knows everything. You see from these initial results taken out of the reference paper that is still submitted and under review, that the false positive and false negative in a range of transmitters is quite significant, between 0.2 and 0.4. So identifying the wireless devices, if it is the transmitter itself to inject noise, seems to be more difficult than when you have an external jammer deployed to protect the privacy. However, this is all work that is ongoing, but in general denotes how much difficult is it to protect against these attacks that work on the physical layer. For the ones interested here, you see some references of the work that I mostly focus, that will be presented in August in Asia CCS in Vietnam, and other works of our research group, basically on the area of radio frequency fingerprinting. I'm happy to take any questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Are there any questions?
So how much signal do you need actually for this fingerprinting? It's really little, I guess, or?
There are approaches that can take only the either of the device, basically, and fingerprint based on that, the either of the transmitted signal. Because the either typically is the part that is always the same in the signal. So that's what is used basically to characterize the device. If you look, however, at the usage of radio frequency fingerprinting on the other side, you can take the whole signal, basically, because that is characterizing the actual device. So the more data you have, the higher the performances are. But there are approaches that can work even with very small data.
Hey, thank you for your talk. You said that the attacker has to use a different piece of equipment to do radio frequency fingerprinting. Is this a different equipment, or is just a better quality receiver?
Yes, so it is I think the right word is a specialized equipment. It's an equipment that is able to extract the raw signal at the physical layer. Normally, with commercial off-the-shelf devices, you don't get that. You get directly the bits of the signal. You don't see what is happening at the physical layer. This device is the software-defined radios, or there are also some chips now by Texas Instruments that are able to do that. They give you the physical layer representation of the signal, what in the talk was referred to as IQ samples.
Hi, great talk. Are you familiar with the work of the late Andreas Fitzmann and the anonymity world in Germany that was working on radio fingerprinting for anonymity purposes, where they were hoping that everyone could have universal radio transmitters, and then they were heartbroken to find out exactly what you're talking about. Everything is unique.
Not sure about the work you refer to, but we can look at it.
And have you looked into cross-protocol analysis? For example, almost all phones, when you unlock them, because of things like Apple and Google Pay, they broadcast a unique identifier for the phone. And even if the device is powered off sometimes. And then you have things like Wi-Fi MAC addresses and Bluetooth MAC addresses. And have you thought about trying to fingerprint like the set of signals from a given device so that you can make a profile even of the type of device based on what it does?
Yeah, so this talk was specifically focused on the physical layer, the raw signal. I believe the information you are talking about is a bit higher in the protocol stack, is at least MAC layer, if you talk about identifiers, all that kind of stuff. So you can see this as an additional attack vector or an additional information available to the adversary with respect to having that information. Yeah, still there.
Hi. Is it possible for the attacker to impersonate another device to forge the fingerprint?
So there is some research on that. Basically, with commercial off-the-shelf devices that are typically designed to be low cost and cheap, no way you can do that. There is some research showing that if you use a very specialized equipment with very high performances, you have chances of impersonating the device. That equipment, as of today, costs $100,000, something like that. So let's say the common assumption is that if you have a very powerful adversary, yes, it can impersonate, for example, a nation state or something like that. It can impersonate the devices. If you have in the wild normal commercial off-the-shelf devices, that's not viable.
So my question earlier, when I was talking about multi-layer, I probably should have made it more clear. You have N transmitters on a device, right? Each transmitter has its own IQ sample that it's going to emit. And so what you can say is you've got the RFID transmitter when you unlock it. At the higher level, you can interpret that, obviously, with the identifiers. But then you also have continuously broadcasting Bluetooth, often Wi-Fi probing. And then you have the EM emissions from the device itself because it's not very well shielded against like Tempest-style attacks. So my question was, do you consider the set of all the transmitters, or are you really thinking about it on a single radio by single radio device? Because it seems like if you're jamming, say, the Wi-Fi in 2.4 or 5 gigahertz, but then it's actually not jamming the RFID signal at the same time, then you're going to see, relative amplitude and so on from all of those radios, and you'll see exactly one of the layers being jammed.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, are you doing basically wideband spectral analysis to fingerprint all the radios on the device?
So now I understand the question. Thank you. So in this work, we consider only one transmitter, one radio. Of course, if your device is characterized by multiple transmitters, each own with its own communication technology, you will need basically a low power jammer for each frequency basically where the device operates. But this work considers only one transmitting radio, one antenna.
Have you looked at the sensitivity of the classification when you change receivers? If you want to track, I think ideally you have a network of receivers to see where the device pops up physically. Have you looked at it?
Yeah, so in the context of this particular work, no. But there are, and we also did it, some works where we applied, for example, radio frequency fingerprinting to identify satellites, LEO satellites of a satellite constellation. And to avoid this problem, to basically take out the receiver in the fingerprint, we did deployments at several locations. So we avoided the location with different receivers, and it worked. So it's in the end, it's about how you train your model, but the model can be trained in a way to be completely agnostic, independent of the receiver and the channel.
Have you considered the influence of temperature changes on the quality of your measurement?
Thank you. For this particular work, no. But there are works that look at that, that have demonstrated that especially for some specific devices, the more they hit, this changes the fingerprint. These works, however, have also demonstrated that you can remove that effect and build a fingerprint that is basically independent of the temperature. All these works that I'm saying, also the other one, they have been all conceived considering the additional security layer. So you can reverse it and they apply also on the other side to track the devices. So it has been done, not by me, but there are works that do that.
I'm sorry, the last remaining questions we will have to take offline. We have a coffee break now, 30 minutes to take questions offline, and then please be back in the room in half an hour, and let's thank Savio again.